Hello, this is Dr. Ahmed Abdelal. Today we're going to speak about developmental speech sound disorders. And the purpose of this is to give an overview. Of course, when you go to grad school, you are going to study an entire course focusing on speech sound disorders. So today we're going to speak about the difference between articulation and phonology, and the difference between articulatory disorders and phonological disorders. Then we discuss what causes these disorders, and then just an overview of the assessment process and some basic treatment techniques. So phonology is basically the science of studying speech sounds and of any specific language. And now we focus on the phonology of the English language. So a phoneme is the smallest speech sound. Now pay attention to the fact that we are speaking about sounds, we are not speaking about spelling. So in phonology, we do not care how you spell the word car, for example. As a matter of fact, when you study the sounds, you study them using International Phonetic Alphabet, and the first sound in the word car, for example, you write it as a regular K. So then we do not pay attention to spelling when we speak about phonetics or phonology. We focus on the sounds that you actually hear, and the English language has 43 sounds. So a speech sound is known as a phoneme. From the Greek word phone means sound, but phone means any sound, including human sounds, but phoneme means a speech sound in particular. So your textbook speaks about sound and meaning, but technically a speech sound doesn't have linguistic meaning. And last time in the previous class we discussed a morpheme. The morpheme is the smallest, now pay attention, smallest linguistic unit that gives meaning. That means, for example, the word cat refers to a particular concept, a particular animal that has particular features and characteristics and so on. But the sound, say, k, for example, at the beginning of the word cat, k, doesn't have a meaning by itself. However, that phoneme, or any phoneme individually, has the ability to alter and to change the meaning of a word. So say, for example, you say the word cat. If you take out the k and put another sound in its place, then you have a different word. If you take out the k at the beginning of that word car, you are going to be left with at. So in any case, taking out one single phoneme out of a word, it will alter that word for, completely. Whether, you replace that sound or not, that word either becomes non-word, or if it is still a word like as in at, it's a totally different word. But in any case, a phoneme is the smallest sound unit in the language, and in isolation it has no linguistic meaning. And as part of a word, if you take one phoneme out, if you delete it or replace it, then you have a totally different word, or you will have a non-word. When two words are different only in a single sound, only in a single phoneme, we call them a minimally contrastive word pair, or simply a minimal pair. So, for example, words like cat and bat, they differ only at the beginning in the first sound. If they differ in more than one sound, then they are not a minimal pair. That sound difference can be in the initial word position at the beginning of a word, or in the final word position, as when you say, for example, stock, stop, in the final word position, or in anywhere in the middle, grass, glass, or share, chair. So as long as it is a single sound, a single phoneme, that is the difference, then you have a minimal pair. Minimal pairs are very important in treatment, and they are used in more than one method of treatment in order to establish the phonetic representations of the sound in the brain, so that you can enable the person to distinguish between one sound and another, and to be able to identify the differences between one word and another in terms of sounds. No one can speak or can produce speech sounds accurately unless they build these phonetic representations in the brain. So now we come to the differences between phonology and articulation. Clinically, when we do treatment or diagnostics, we do not anymore refer to these differences. We say phonological disorder or articulation disorder. These differences no longer exist. However, we use for diagnostics to make a diagnosis in any speech or language, for any speech or language disorder, we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the same manual that is used by psychiatrists and neurologists and psychologists to diagnose various disorders that are caused by any kind of brain abnormality, whether that is cognitive or neurological. So, in the past, like in the 70s and 80s, and even into the 90s, there was that speech sound disorders were called phonological disorders. They were called articulation and phonological disorders. And also, finally, after 2013, the name became simply speech sound disorders. So the current name, the only name for speech articulation problems today that we acknowledge and we can bill insurance companies for reimbursement for and so on, this is just simply called speech sound disorder. But still, the difference between phonology and articulation are different for our purposes as students and as faculty and as clinicians to understand the nature and the relationship between hearing and perception and muscular activation to produce speech. So when you say phonology, it refers to hearing. It refers to the internalization of the speech sounds that the children hear before birth and continue hearing, throughout life. So the exposure to the sounds of the language and of the native language builds the neurological foundations that we know as mental representations of the sounds. So every sound becomes coded in, and particular neurons fire when they hear that sound or when we produce that sound. But before we are able to produce these sounds, we must have the internal representations, and these representations will serve exactly like as the software that is used to activate something like, say, a printer, for example, that will make things in the printer roll and physically produce mechanical movements. just simply by, putting some kind of software into the computer. So when we say phonology, someone has phonological problems, we say we are implying that the brain itself doesn't have accurate or complete phonological representations of the sounds of that language, and as a result, the production can never be perfect. It cannot be complete, or it cannot be accurate. So, however, when that is, generally the person has the language representations and so on, they have articulation problems. Sometimes they might not be able to say the R sound or the L sound or the ch or sh, but individual kind of sounds that are isolated, then that will be mostly a problem of muscular production. So in other words, if the computer, the software is good, and the printer is good, but the connection between the computer and the printer is not intact, is not good, then he cannot send the commands, the electronic commands, to the printer to do the movements it's supposed to do. So articulation problems are somehow related to the motor activation, and that could be between the pathways that connect the areas where the speech sounds are stored and the muscles that we use in order to produce speech. So again, phonology involves hearing and auditory perception and the internalization of the sounds, while articulation involves or refers to the physical, muscular production of speech sounds. Speech sounds generally, I can tell you about both. The phonological part that enables us to internalize all the speech sounds of the language. First, in order to build that and to be able to distinguish between one sound and the other, you have to be exposed, you have to constantly expose the neurons in the brain and the auditory pathways to the sounds that you want to internalize. This process begins before birth. 20 weeks into pregnancy, the cochlear system and the auditory system is completely mature, and it is similar to that of an adult, which gives the fetus, the baby, the ability to hear the sounds. They hear them, of course, in a little bit differently, but when a pregnant mother is reading or speaking, that fetus is going to be listening and hearing these sounds, and the neurons will be firing in response, so the baby will recognize the native language and the voice of the mother before being born, and right at birth that baby is going to recognize the mother's voice and the native language. Speech sounds are internalized, and the full repertoire is stored in the brain by age 11 months. 11 months. So this is where the baby begins to be a specialist in the native language and begins to ignore foreign languages, and basically, unless you of course intentionally introduce that child to foreign languages by speaking and exposing the child to different sounds of that language. So the phonological component begins early in development. Now, I want to attract your attention to one important fact, which unfortunately we haven't yet explored in depth, and classically you will come across speech sound disorders, and 70% of these disorders are attributed to no causality. We do not know why. However, if we know now, modern research shows us that by 11 months of age, the baby has internalized the phonological repertoire. All the 43 sounds of the language are internalized and stored. Then, babies, when they are young, they have smaller ear canals, smaller eustachian tubes. The orientation of the eustachian tubes and the ear canals are different than those of the adult. That promotes middle ear infections, and middle ear infections are most frequent among babies between ages around ages 18 months and 6 and 5 years and a half. So yes, they do occur at birth even, but most children tend to have them more intensely and more frequently at ages 1 year and a half, and also the other peak is 5 years and a half, between 5 years and 5 years and a half. What does that tell you? It tells you that very early in development, these infections, especially some of them will last for, the acute stage goes away, but the fluid that accumulates after can stay in the ear for weeks and months. So as a result, that will deprive the child, the developing child, of the sounds, of developing phonological representations in the brain. So that kind of becomes incomplete. As a result, the baby will never be able to perfectly produce articulation when the neurological system is mature enough, because the representations were not built. In order to produce a particular sound, you have to hear it a particular number of times, like millions and millions of times for each sound. So in terms of articulation, that is kind of a function of the muscular system, the neurological system that connects the cerebral cortex, the brain, that gives the commands, motor commands and intentions, to the pathways that connect to the muscles of speech, respiration, phonation, articulation. So that system matures by age 8 years, and all sounds motorically and phonologically and everything, the child masters all the sounds of the language fully by 8 years of age. And that's in the later part, of course. We're looking universally at all children in the world. So, but you will come across children who are 5 years old and they master everything. 4 years old, they master everything. But again, we are speaking about billions of children, and in general, and giving you upper limits, which is 8 years of age. Beyond that, if someone has a speech sound problem, then that becomes There are norms, of course, and there are particular stages in development for speech sounds. And as I explained to you, the milestones of speech development, number one, begin with the internalization, the kind of storage and internalization of the building the speech sound representations or mental images of the sounds in the brain. And that is typically in the left hemisphere of the brain. So, and that is accomplished by age 11 months. Between 7 months or up to 7 months, the child is able to distinguish between any sound in any different language and another sound. Like say, an English baby will be able to distinguish different sounds in Chinese, in Vietnamese, in Arabic, or any other language. So any baby in the world, 7 months of age, they are able to make distinctions among different sounds in different languages in the whole world. So the baby is not yet specialized in his or her native language particularly, but even though they know these sounds, but they are open still to have that acute ability that will enable them to distinguish sounds from any language. And then you have that window of opportunity open between 7 months and 11 months or so. Right after that, then it tends to kind of close, and children by the 11th or 12th month, they start to lose that acute sense of discrimination, and they focus only on their native language. And then in terms of production, the two charts that you have here represent or show production when children are able to produce every particular sound. But before that, we, in terms of developmental milestones for speech sound production, the baby begins to coo between the first and the second months. They make sounds, vowel sounds or semi-vowel sounds that develop into vowel sounds. The baby, as soon as the baby is born, when they cry, as they cry, they experience the kind of ability to control the airway. So you control the airstream, especially as it goes out. And that control eventually enables them to regulate the production of individual sounds, to coordinate phonation with respiration, with articulation. So it begins very early. When they cry, they experience again, they strengthen that connection, and they start to control the airway. That control later gives rise to the control of speech, the volume of air as it goes out, and then that you interrupt by the vocal folds and by the particular organs of speech in order to chop that airstream into sounds and into words and sentences. So then, between ages 2 months and 4 months, the baby begins to babble, which means they will make syllables. And a syllable is a combination, mostly for the most part, is a combination of a consonant and a vowel. So that babbling, like ta, ta, da, da, ma, ma, da, da, all these will be just repeated. And then between ages 6 months and 8 months, then that babbling becomes better developed, and they combine syllables of different structures like ma, ta, da, ka. So syllables that are different, two syllables are combined and they are not repeating each other. So that is often called variegated babbling, or I would call it diversified babbling. So then the baby says the first word between ages 10 months and 14 months with an average of 12 months. So at their birthday, the first birthday, they should be able to say the first word in their native language, and they should be able to make the first step. So they walk and say the first word almost at the same time. And after that, when they say the first word, it increases quickly, and that brings us into language acquisition and development, and that's a different topic. But then we focus looking at this individual sounds. Now look at the individual sounds. This graphic shows you by age basically 3 years, you have the baby should have mastered all sounds. 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. So by 7, they are, again, there's a lot of research that shows a lot of different data, but it is definitely between 7 years and 8 years that students master all these sounds. Another graphic shows is age 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. This brings it up to 8 years. And under each year, you're going to see the sounds that that baby masters. Or 90% of children who are, say, 3 years old, they master these sounds by the end of the 3rd year. 4 years here, 95% of the children master these sounds in addition at this age, and so on. Now, we look into the difference between a speech sound delay and a speech sound disorder. The delay implies that the child is developing normally, however, slowly. And as a result, when you look at the sequence, that normal sequence of sound development, this child, for example, produces all the sounds that are in a child who is 3 years old produces in the same levels. And of course, there are even more detailed descriptions. When you study phonetics, you see the development based on each month and so on. So they develop these sounds in the same sequence as other children, but when they develop them at a slower pace. In terms of a disorder, first, the sequence is different, and also the child's speech, there's a big gap between the child. Let's say you have someone who's 10 years old, that person is going to have a disorder, not a delay. The delay goes maybe 6 months, maybe something like that. But also in a disorder, there are more speech sounds involved, and that the sounds are not following the normal sequence in development. So, for example, even though the N sound here, the N sound is a very early sound. It's, as a matter of fact, 3 or 4 months the baby might be able to produce that sound. So I had a child at some point who was in 3rd grade, and she was not able to produce the N sound. She would make it as an for example, night. She would say night. So banana, she would say, no, I don't remember how she would say banana, but things, especially at the beginning of the word, neighbor, as in king. So that was a disorder. That meant that she was very, very late. I mean, that sound was not emerging even when she was in 3rd grade. Even though the sound, for example, let's say the sound t, as in say Tom. In some cases, the child would say it as a k. So t becomes k, like Tom becomes calm. So even though that sound is an early occurring sound, then the child would not be saying it in that sequence, and maybe saying other sounds that occur at age 4 and 5 and so on. So generally, for delays, we understand that it's a matter of time before the child is able to produce the sound. Another sign is, for a delay, the child is able to produce the sound in different situations. Like, say, for example, if the sound comes at the end of the word, the child is able to produce it, but is not able to produce it yet at the beginning or the middle of the word. Or it could be that he or she is able to produce it at the beginning and the end, but not yet in the middle. If they are able to produce the sound in any context or any position of the word, we call this developing or emerging. The technical term is emerging, which means developing. And that's a sign of delay. And whether you provide intervention or not, that child is going to catch up. However, in order to be on the safe side, to be more cautious, we monitor and we give suggestions, and we might give recommendations for parents and teachers to monitor the production of the child and to give them the child some more attention, so that indirectly we ensure the child that delay doesn't develop into a disorder. So again, in terms of the clinical diagnostics terms, we no longer use phonological disorders. We no longer use articulation. We simply call a disorder speech sound disorder. That's it. When you open the DSM-5, you will find this only that, and there is no other disorder. But for clarification again, just to establish the connection between hearing and speaking, and also for our clinical purposes, I am gonna just explain the aspect. I'm not gonna call it phonological disorder, but I'm gonna call it the phonologically based deficits, or phonologically based speech deficits versus the articulation based. When a child only has the motor problems involved, that's articulation, typically there are less sounds involved. Typically you might find the some of the later occurring sounds, for example, l. These sounds the child might have problem with. Many children actually, experience that. The S, and for example, making it as an F. So the child would either, in terms of articulation disorders, might either omit a sound, leave it out, like cat could be ka, and just one sound, wherever that comes at the end of a word, they would just say, they would take it out. Or substitution, that's very common, like feather, the child would say feather. Bath, they would say bat. They might say light as white. They might say thumb as thumb. They might say van as ban. So as long as these are a few sounds and that are replaced or omitted or distorted, we call this speech sound, which just articulation errors. When the child has phonological problems, we'll be discussing this in more detail. Phonological problems, we describe them as having phonological processes, which means that a phonological process is the trial and error that the normally developing child goes through as they learn and they acquire and practice production of these sounds. However, they are normal, like a child who's 2 years old. You're expecting that they cannot say the R for the most part. Most of them, they cannot. So they say right, they say white. Or ring, they're going to say wing. That is totally fine. But if that same child at age 7 years says ring wing, then that is a problem. So as the child is learning or acquiring the sounds and learning how to produce them, they go through these errors. But they don't last long, and without any intervention or anything, when their nervous system is ready and well developed, they will produce those sounds. When these sounds are not produced by that particular time that is expected, we call them phonological processes, and that means they are more involved. They originally result from abnormality in the mental representations. It means that the child has not had enough stimulation, didn't hear the sounds frequently enough in the language for whatever reason, maybe because of frequent middle ear infections, maybe because of a lot of accumulation of earwax in the ear canals, for whatever reason, the child did not have enough access to the sounds in the environment, and as a result, that child did not develop the phonological representations, and that caused the phonological processes to persist beyond the developmental stage when they were supposed to emerge. Those sounds were supposed to emerge. So the errors are more severe, more involved. Mostly whole categories of the sounds are affected. For example, there are patterns like this: cluster reduction. The child will have difficulty with any particular clusters of sound, of consonants. Clustered examples: the consonant f and they are a cluster, as in Frank. Climb, k, climb, k, together. Cry, k, spoon, sp. Two consonants or more that occur together with no vowel in between. That's called the consonant cluster. And cluster reduction means eliminating one of these sounds, one or more of these sounds in the cluster. So, for example, try becomes tie. It doesn't become twy because you are not replacing. You completely take it and do not replace it with any other sound. So try becomes tie. Another example, spring, for example, becomes sing, or ping. They take the S out, becomes ping. So taking out any one of these consonants out of the cluster, it reduces it. It makes it what we know as cluster reduction. And wherever that sound occurs, or this combination occurs in a particular word, the child will have difficulty with it the same way. So all through. There's another process, phonological process, called weak syllable deletion. Whenever there's a word that has a weak syllable that is not stressed, the child takes out the entire syllable out. Like banana, say banana. So you notice the first syllable is not emphasized enough. So the baby just knocks it out. So the word becomes nana. Banana becomes nana. Spaghetti becomes getty, for example. So that is every time the child is going to see a word like this, and they notice that one syllable, if that multisyllabic word is not stressed, they will knock it out and they will reduce the word into the example like you see. And there's the final consonant deletion, which means any word, for example, that ends in a particular sound, that sound at the end of that word is deleted. Say, for example, dog becomes do, cat becomes ka, book becomes bo. They don't say that last sound. Usually that points to difficulty with hearing. That difficulty with hearing might have occurred earlier in life when the child had more middle ear infections. And now, even though the child doesn't have the infections anymore, then, they still have the problem because no one, enabled them to fill that gap. The only way they can fill that gap is to hear the sound, to make up for what they lost in terms of hearing the sound. Now, when we describe severity levels, severity means the kind of how involved is the problem, how bad is the problem. And this, the severity levels apply to any disease or any disorder. We commonly use three categories, which is mild, moderate, and severe. These are the three general categories. However, we make variations, two more variations out of these, two more combinations. For example, a disorder can be mild or moderate, or in between, sometimes borderline, sometimes. So we make a judgment. So it's a moderate dash severe. Mild dash moderate, mild to moderate. It is like in between, or moderate to severe. So we end up having 5 categories, but the main categories are 3: mild, moderate, and severe. And these are the ones that we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss the characteristics or the features of a mild speech sound disorder. What does it look like? And moderate, and then severe. So the severity levels, they relate to, or they are distinguished by, the number of sounds that are produced correctly, the accuracy of production, the ability to produce sounds in different word positions, like at the beginning of the word, the end of the word, and the middle. And you notice that I'm saying the beginning first, and then the end, and then the middle. The reason is, for the most part, production of sounds is easier at the beginning and end, and then it is the second level is the middle. The middle, when the sound comes in the middle of a word, it becomes harder because a sound is affected by the phonetic environment, by phonological environment. It is affected by the sound that comes before it and the sound that comes after it. But you do not have in terms of the middle, you have a sound that has something before it and after it that makes it challenging. But for the beginning, you do not have anything on one side, and then you have a sound coming after. That is okay. But then the end, you have something before, but you don't have something after. So this is why the beginning or the middle of a word are easier than the middle. So also we look at the ability to sequence sounds, to produce them in the right sequence. Is the person saying spaghetti or biscotti, for example, hospital or hopsital, for example. And then the ability to produce various types of words. So like monosyllabic words made up of one syllable, like cat, book, door. Or multi-syllabic words, words that have more than one syllable. The levels of severity are related to intelligibility, or the levels of intelligibility. Intelligible means understandable. Intelligibility, it refers to the ability to understand someone's speech. So when we say the level of intelligibility of that individual is reduced, we are not referring to our own speech. We are saying that our ability to understand that person's speech is reduced because that person is not producing the sounds accurately, and that there are so many errors, for example, that will make us unable to understand what that child means. So that's what we mean by reduced intelligibility. So the level of intelligibility can be perfect, or it can be decreased by 50%, by 25%, or by 30%, or the person could be unintelligible. So in terms of the mild severity, the mild speech sound disorder kind of level, the person will have just a few sounds that are produced incorrectly, like maybe the maybe the s, maybe the l, for example, maybe the ch or the sh, like shoe could become su, or chew could become shoe. So a limited number of sounds involved, and it usually involves some of the later occurring sounds. For example, sh could become s, like show could become so. th as in thumb could become tum or thumb or tum. The voiced th as in like say breathe as in breathe or bathe, that is a voice sound, and that also could be affected. The person might replace it typically with a d, as in feather becomes feather, my father becomes my father. And then the s, the s, and the z, l, j. And so these are examples of the sounds that could usually be affected because they are later occurring sounds. But generally, the level of intelligibility of mild speech sound disorders, that level is intelligible to most speakers, stranger, familiar speakers or unfamiliar speakers. Like family members have no difficulty understanding the child. A stranger on the street would have no difficulty understanding the child because they can see if they're saying say right as white with the context, that they will be able to understand that the child doesn't have the R sound. A moderate speech sound disorder involves difficulty producing all the sounds within a single class. Single class, that means that we discussed that in the previous recording. When you look at the consonant phonemes, we divided them into two big categories. We divided them into something called obstruent sounds and non-obstruent sounds, or resonant sounds, non-resonant sounds. So anyways, the obstruents include stop sounds like p, b, t, d, k, g, and So these are 7 stop sounds where the airway completely is shut down. So all these stop sounds could be affected. A child would have difficulty in like most of the categories, or all the sounds in that category can be, maybe most of them or some of them in the whole category can be affected. Interestingly, when you treat one sound of these, the person makes progress on the other sounds in the same category, even without intervention, but just if you address just one. The person might have a difficulty with the category known as velars, velar sounds like k, g, These are velar sounds. Maybe he or she will have difficulty with the final consonant deletion. Just everywhere it comes, they will have difficulty with that. Incorrect use of sounds in certain positions, like say at the beginning of a word, every time the sound say s, all the time it is produced as t. Swim becomes twim. Every time it comes at the end, for example, and so on. So consistently, every time the sound comes in a position of a word, the same position in all words, it will be substituted with another sound. Cluster reduction. For example, blue becomes boo, for example. So, and you have a lot of examples of these. And wherever there is a cluster, for example, that involves the b and the l, as blink becomes bink, the person will have the same difficulty in various words. And the child or the person becomes intelligible to friends and to family members because they are familiar with the child. They know how the child has been speaking, and from the context they can understand the child because they are familiar to him or her. However, unfamiliar listeners will have difficulty figuring out what is exactly the child saying, what the child is exactly saying. So the prognosis is good, but the treatment is going to take a longer time. In terms of the severe level of speech sound disorders. Generally, the person is unintelligible to most listeners, strangers, friends, classmates, but the family, because they have lived with the person for a long time, obviously, they will be able to understand, figure out in different ways by looking, by pointing, and so on. They will be able to understand the person better than others. The person will have more than 6 sounds in error in all positions of the words, beginning, middle, and that sound wouldn't exist. Like, say, for example, the person will say ch as ch. So if you say chair, ch, they will say chair. If you say cat, ch, at the end, say cat. If they say say dishes, they say dishes. So everywhere that sound comes will be distorted the same way in all positions of the word, and the person becomes unintelligible again to most listeners and may rely heavily on gestures. That is an indication generally that the person either has significant hearing problems or significant limitations in speech or language. They rely on gestures. So here are some examples that we'll go over and that will show us how a word sounds when it is produced by someone who has a mild, moderate, or severe level of speech sound disorder. So the word soup in the mild category will become thoop, like a lisp, dental lisp, thoop. And then moderate is going to take the S completely out and put another sound, which is a T. It will become toop. By the way, the chart uses International Phonetic Alphabet symbols. So the U here that you see here is actually the symbol for the sound oo, as in pool or food. Okay, so here it is, you read it phonetically, it is soup. The S here, obviously the author didn't put the symbol for that. It's a different symbol. But just to say, when the person says thoop, because of whatever reason, that's a lisp, and in here toop, and the person with severe is gonna do more than one error. First, they will replace the S with a T, becomes toop, and then they delete the P. So soup becomes toop. And it takes a specialist, an expert, to identify these errors and to bring them back to the original. And this is how you need to do phonological analysis to sort that out and to design better treatments, effective treatments. Rabbit for the mild becomes wabbit. Between the B and T, that sound is the capitalized A, capitalized I. Okay, so that's not the L, that's the capitalized I. And so that is wabbit. Only the is replaced by W. Now here, moderate would say wabby. Wabby would take, he or she substitutes the and also then at the end, they don't have the T. So they have two things. And then the severe wouldn't have the W at all, wouldn't have the or replace it with anything, just completely eliminates it. And then is gonna go like this, rabbit. So that is gonna sound completely unintelligible. Yellow for the mild becomes yo, and then moderate becomes wo, and then severe becomes o. Crayon becomes quayan here, the again, that's not an L, and then kayan for the moderate, and then you have aya for the severe. But you cannot understand this unless someone is pointing to a crayon and saying, making these sounds. So butterfly becomes butterfly, or buffy, or I. And then refrigerator becomes refrigerator, or refrigerator, or we. So that again gives you an idea, and this basically you are going to meet all kinds of speech sound problems that do not fall within these categories, but we try to sort things out to make, to give you the best picture possible. These are the same but represented in a different way. So then lastly, we speak about bilingual